So I thought we might just start and ask each of you to take 2 minutes and say a little bit about your work, sort of a quick introduction, and then we'll go to some questions, and then we'll leave some time for the audience to ask questions. So,
awesome. Hello, I'm Pete Billington. I'm the co-founder of Fable Studio and the director of Wolves in the Walls, which is an immersive fable based on the book by Neil Gaiman. Yeah, I think I have something to show here. Let's see. So this is, we can turn down the volume. I'll just talk over this. But Wolves, you guys don't need to hear the music. Wolves was sort of a huge experiment in how do we balance interaction with narrative. It was at the birth of touch controllers for Oculus, so we knew we had to use our hands, and we got really inspired in an earlier piece that we had worked on called Henry, where a character just makes simple eye contact with us. And we felt, you know, that little tingly sense on the back of our necks when a character actually acknowledged us in a space, and we wanted to really invest in what it would mean to have this direct contact with a character. And so we spent about a year just doing pure R&D on character connection and having hands. And that meant a lot of prototyping and testing. So in this case, we're using tic-tac-toe, and we're using machine vision here for Lucy, and this is a very early version of Lucy, to detect whether we've drawn an X or an O. And then if we were to switch, she would accuse us of cheating. But we got really invested in the idea that objects have backstories and exposition, and that they have emotional payload. And so we did a ton of experiments around that and realized that it completely distracted us from the narrative. And that was probably the biggest mistake we learned, or we made. And what we learned from that is that objects need to connect us directly to both the character and to that character's arc. And that's ultimately what we discovered. I'm not going to play all of this, but that was sort of the thing that we unlocked that made Wolves possible.
Great insight.
Cool. I'm gonna hit this.
Okay, I'm Aaron Bradbury. I'm director on Vestige, and Vestige is based on interviews I did with an amazing woman called Lisa Elin. Her husband passed away just over 2 years ago, and I interviewed her for around a year and a half after his death. And Vestige kind of takes you on the journey of grief that she went on, and it kind of it covers all of the memories that she has of Eric over that time and how they change and how she changes and transforms as a person from that experience of grief. I guess my background is originally kind of coming from a painting background, then moving into animation and short filmmaking, interactive installations. And then around 10 years ago, started working at the National Space Centre in the UK, working on immersive media, so working in full dome, multimedia, kind of interactive installation things again. And then, yeah, into VR and, whatever's next. Oh, I had so much to show you, but...
No, show it.
I've got 40 seconds. This is just a little bit behind the scenes of shooting Vestige. So you can see we have an actor in a 360 green screen studio, and we're playing the audio from the Skype interviews that I did with Lisa through this. The actor's mouthing the words, and we're filming with a volumetric camera, which we can then place a three-dimensional version of the actor into the scene, into VR, and you can move around, and occasionally the characters move through you as well.
A lot. I don't have a cool video, but I do have a logo, so I have a slide. Yes, Miriam, I have a slide. That will slowly transition in space. So I'm Jessica Brillhart. I founded and am the creative director, a lead creative director for a company called Vrai Pictures out of Brooklyn, New York. It's a beautiful French word, so thank you very much. For those of you, a lot of you who know French, obviously Vrai means true or real, depending on its use. I came up with a name when I was actually trying to say that's true to someone who knew that I was actually looking for a name for a new immersive company that I was starting, and then frantically wrote it down and showed it to me. I'm like, oh, it has all the letters in it? That's crazy. It was not my intent, but it made a lot of sense for me to do this. I was at Google for 8 years. I was their principal filmmaker for VR. I field tested a lot of their equipment, including the Google Jump Rig, which was something, it was my baby. So I was like trying to actually get that into the world by testing it as a creator would test it, as a filmmaker would try to test it. The piece that I did here is called Beethoven's Fifth, which is in the cool 90s looking basement downstairs. You know, do some drugs, listen to some Beethoven, like ride the wave into interstellar space. The piece was actually, you know, joking aside, was something that I was trying to do at Google. It was the last thing I was trying to do, which is to reimagine the content on something called the Golden Record in virtual reality. The Golden Record was a curated group of photos, sounds, music. It was led by Carl Sagan, Ann Druyan, and was done with NASA. And this golden disc with all our stuff on it was launched with 2 interstellar-bound probes called the Voyager probes. One is definitely in interstellar space now. The other one, I think, is still trying to get through the heliosheath. Long story. Which is to say, it's what you see in the piece is a data visualization of what Voyager 1 might have seen going into interstellar space. It's the first time data on that scale from NASA has ever been used to visualize something for us. But a lot of what it is it's about really hearing. You know, Beethoven's Fifth as a track is a part of it, but it's really about how do we as humans hear. So that's why you have the sub-pack for haptics, and there are all sorts of interesting stuff in there baked in so that we can connect with each other through a perceptual ability. So yeah, that's it. You got my ties.
Cool. Since I've had the chance to introduce my work this morning, I thought it would be a great idea to show you some visuals and some teasers. So here is a small teaser from Jack, which is the last piece I premiered at Tribeca, which is a live performance. It's a VR piece that is supported by live motion capture and actually staged interaction, followed by a small teaser of The Real Thing, which is the piece that is available upstairs, which is an ambitious 8K documentary about Chinese copycat architecture and the uncanniness of living and breathing inside these virtual tangible spaces. So here we go. That is Jack. Very different style. The Real Thing.
法国巴黎那边，大部分的普通民众应该不会知道这里有一个跟他一样的双胞胎的城市在这里。
我们这边建这个威尼斯水城呢，只是取了它一个外的框架，框架复制过来之后，真正的生活方式并没有复制过来。
正好这个拍摄的过程就是也是很好的体验，就没有离开中国的情况下，如果哪一天真的去了伦敦，然后站在伦敦桥的边上，可能反而会有一种很亲切的感觉。好玩一点说的话，有可能有点家乡的味道。
Here you go.
Wow, beautiful. Thank you. So let's begin at the beginning. Where does the inspiration come for the works that you're doing, and how do you decide which pieces to create, to devote your skills to and your time?
So I had a pretty profound moment at the start of the project we knew, as I said, we knew that we needed to use hands. And I think we had close to one of the first pair of non-engineer at Oculus touch controllers. All the guts were exposed, and I actually had to share one with the developer that I was working with, so I had the left controller and he had the right. And we knew we needed to connect to a character, but prior to doing that, I got to go to Facebook, to this black box, and do a demo that many people have probably experienced now called Toy Box. And it starts with another human putting on a headset and handing you these controllers and then disappearing and showing up in virtual reality in front of you as just a floating head and hands. And the first thing we did was a fist bump. And it was so natural. We just bumped hands. Of course, we didn't have the haptic feedback that we heard about this morning, but the second thing we did was they picked up a cube and offered it to me, and I took it. And then we proceeded to do all these crazy things that were part of this demo, but what happened after was I kind of stumbled out of that and sat in my car for about 30 minutes in the parking lot and realized that the 20 years of storytelling that I had just spent my life studying was just going to change forever.
Yep.
It was completely different because that was a person driving an avatar, but that could have been a virtual character. That cube could have been anything that we could possibly imagine, and now all of a sudden I have agency in a story. And so we quickly, built a prototype character, and we had her offer us a flashlight, and we were able to assist that character looking in the dark, and we had a superpower, and we knew we were onto something pretty magical, and we just had to keep going and make a ton of mistakes until we found a way to tell the story. But it was a very memorable moment to be able to connect to a character in that way.
Powerful.
So mine was, I think most of my film ideas, story ideas, come from music, and this one came from a piece of music by a guy called Starkey, Philadelphia-based musician. And yeah, I find music a very visual kind of experience, listening to music and experiencing stories kind of unfold when listening to stuff. And yeah, this piece of music, it's like, sounds kind of cheesy, but honestly, like, it nearly like kind of led me to tears, like listening to this piece of music, which is weird because it's like a drum and bass musician normally. But yeah, I remember like going around friends' houses and kind of describing this experience of, initially the story was a guy reaching out for his lover who was being hit by a car, and this like frozen moment of her dying, and that was his memory of her. And they couldn't quite like hear that story in there, but then that became the kind of the blueprint for the idea of Vestige. And then it wasn't until kind of going to Dev Lab in 2016 and developing the idea a bit more, I got put in touch with Lisa, and then it was, yeah, from the interviews with her, I realized it shouldn't really be a fictional piece, it should be her story.
Wow. That's amazing. Jessica?
I think my favorite story about the piece, and we talked about this too, was I was doing a talk at MIT, and I was explaining I was working on this piece that had all this sort of audio into it. Like I was really thinking about disability and thinking about how people, who are deaf reinterpret the world. So I was like looking into Oliver Sacks's movement parsing and thinking about sign language and thinking about tinnitus, which was what Beethoven had himself, and using audio as a means of like transfer people around the space. So I was talking about all these layers, and as I was leaving, someone started chasing after me, screaming Helen Keller really loudly at me, like, Helen Keller! And I'm like, now if I didn't work in this medium, I would probably have sprinted as fast as I could out of the building, but usually that's like, crazy stuff happens all the time to all of us. So I'm like, just stay there and just figure out what the deal is. And he had mentioned that Helen Keller, when she was, during a broadcast of Beethoven's Ninth, had put her hand to the radio and had felt the vibrations of that symphony, and had written a note to the radio station saying, I heard, and she was deaf and blind, I heard the brass and the violins and the vocals, but I also felt like I connected with Beethoven. And she said, I don't think he knew this because he was afflicted with deafness himself, but because of that, he had almost inadvertently become a composer for the deaf, and he's like, kids at the school in Boston were actually using Beethoven to connect with music because it was so vibrational, because he had banged so hard on the piano in order to hear his own music. And so I got to meet Subpack, and they make these really great haptic backpacks, mostly for gamers, so they can feel the guns, you know. And so, but this, it was like they've been using it also to get kids to hear sounds that they wouldn't normally hear, because you know kids who are deaf. So I just literally plugged it in to the mix, and it was as if there was a voice behind this music the whole time that I just had never heard, because I never thought to, and it just worked. And we premiered it at Sheffield Doc Fest, and it was, or Alt Reality, sorry, Dan. I had so many festivals. But no, it was great. Dan brought it in, and what we actually had, we had a great deal of people come in who were disabled. There were people who had a lot of, there were a few that were deaf, and they came through. And they were so emotional because it felt that for the first time there was an immersive experience that was made for them. And you also had people come back to the experience who willingly took off their headphones so they could just feel it. And I thought, this is what this is about. It's not, we talk about surface connection, like come into the experience and feel like you have this disease or that, affliction or whatever. But it's so literal. And suddenly you had people who could hear just fine make themselves essentially deaf because they wanted to reinterpret the world because they thought it was a beautiful way to experience the world. Not because they wanted to feel what it was like to be deaf, but because they just wanted to understand the world in a different way. And I think that's something that I want to strive to do in everything I make moving forward.
It's a great story.
Well, when I tried to find some common ground between a piece like The Real Thing and Alice or Jack, for example, I think it's linked to the way I see VR. For me, VR is very profound in the way that you had photography, you had time to photography, and then you have cinema. And for me, you had space to cinema, and now you have VR. So I'm kind of obsessed by the notion of spatial storytelling and how to tell a story inside a space. And that was the core of the design for Alice. But when Benoît Felici, the co-director of The Real Thing, approached me because he was directing a feature documentary for television about this specific subject, and he asked me to help him on building this VR piece, I was like, this is going to be great, because this is a piece about the relationship between human and architecture. And what a better medium than VR to have a reflection around what it means to live in these spaces that are actually virtual, tangible, chunky set design, real scale set designs. So for me, it was very logical and very natural to work on all these pieces, because it's at the core of the design for all my experience. It's linked to what does it mean to exist inside a space as a viewer, and what does it mean to have this new relationship with directing, which is free roaming inside a space. What does it mean to wander inside a story rather than just sitting there and listening and watching it?
Well, that's a perfect segue to my next question, which is about how you feel as storytellers giving up agency, right? Traditionally, storytellers, whether they're authors or they're filmmakers, guard very passionately the control of the narrative and the creation of the characters, and they want it to be the way they want it to be and experience the way they imagine it. And all of you in different ways are experiencing letting go as storytellers and making room for the audience, or as I love saying, the people formerly known as the audience, because now we're not passive. So how do you factor that in? How do you feel about it? You're clearly not people who feel threatened by this. You've embraced it. How important is it, and where are you going with it?
Yeah, I think, it's easy, depending on where you came from, it's easy to mourn the loss of control and specifically tools and more importantly, a lexicon. And we talk a lot about cinematography, and to the point where I think probably most of us are exhausted about that discussion about you don't have control of the camera and you don't have control of lensing. And so that was, for us, it was something that we had to tackle early. And what we found was that while you do mourn the loss, you are in wonder at the new opportunities of these experimental mediums. And they provide you with all of these new ways to express yourself. So I can't control the lens that I have on my camera and I can't control its position, but there's an emotional intent with those decisions. And so now I need to find what that emotional intent means in this new medium. And oh, and by the way, I have a superpower, which is I can completely manipulate this space in any way I want. So a lens is a way of recording a physical space with light, but I can control that physical space any way I want. So we call that emotional cinematography or emotional POV, which means that, in this story, Lucy creates us as an audience. We still call it the audience. And we see the world the way that she feels the world. So if she wants us to feel scared, she can make the space feel scary by stretching it, by twisting it, by making the set decoration sharper and more angular. If we need to smooth something out or make a character feel imposing, we can make them twice as tall. These are superpowers, and with superpowers, we can do magic tricks. So I really feel like, yes, we have to honor the fact that we've lost a lot of these things that we've come to rely on, but there's probably 1,000 more that we haven't discovered, and that's why I'm doing it, because we get to actually go out and find these new techniques and share them with each other and get inspired by the ones that other people discover, and then maybe we sneak one of those into our works, and those start to build on top of each other. So it's actually a lovely process. And then, to understand that the audience gets to make choices is also, completely changes the medium. So I think it is a mistake to think of the adaptation of a former medium in terms of where this is headed. It's about understanding what each of these mediums contribute, and where you need to completely explore on your own to think.
Did you get a chance earlier today, I'm sorry I missed that panel, to talk about what Alice and Jack are? Does this audience know?
A bit. We had the chance to explain a bit, but
Okay.
to follow up on your question, I mean, I'm not giving up anything. That's the real answer. That's the real answer. And if I done my job well, then you think you were free inside the piece, which is, I think, the design of everything. I had this debate with some filmmaker friends from traditional medium telling me, how can you still call yourself a director since you don't have any framing anymore? And the editing is so different, so you're not directing a film anymore. And it's very wrong to see it that way. Actually, it's not because it's 360 that you don't have a frame, because the viewer doesn't see the whole 360 at the same time. He actually has a frame. He's just responsible for it. So if the experience is designed and directed properly, then I know where the viewer is going to look at a very specific point. And in the directing of a piece like The Real Thing, it's very funny when you have like a 360 cinema. Oh, sorry. When you have a 360 cinema with 60 people watching at the piece, and you see them turning their heads simultaneously at the exact same spots, because they felt like they can watch everything, but they were actually watching what I wanted them to watch. And it's a similar design for Jack and Alice.
Right.
If I done my job well, people in the end will think they were totally free inside the space. But what happened to them was designed, and it was pre-designed, and it was built so that they have the sensation of freedom. And I think this is definitely a new form of directing, because it's you need to address the fact that your viewer is a bit more free, but you're not giving up anything. I'm not letting him wander inside this space.
I mean, I don't fancy myself a director anymore. I can't. I mean, I kind of call myself an immersive director because I don't know what to call myself, and it's the easiest thing for people to grok. And it feels like I feel like a kind of a jerk for calling myself an architect, but I feel more like an architect or a designer, to be honest. Like, you look at architecture in games, because I feel more like my work's about where stories emerge, not about me being the storyteller in it. I think Doug Trumbull calls it experience making or crafting, and people call it storycraft. I mean, no one knows what to call anything, but we're just sort of throwing names and terms out the window. Mostly because, and I think it was a fundamental shift for me in language, right? Where it was, I don't call them viewers, I call them visitors. I don't think about frames, I think about worlds of frames. I think about attention and engagement within those. I mean, everything that's been talked about today all feeds into this, right? Like the way our minds interpret space and how that space resonates back. Thinking about perception and how that shifts, how it's different, how we see the colors differently. I see burnt orange, someone might see yellow.
Please, not on these cameras.
Not on these cameras, though. It's totally orange. It's fine. It's a lot great. Sorry, joke. But some people can hear great, some can't. And I think that it's all of that leads to narrative, right? Like how we can interact, how interactions shift and change over time. how we grow old, how we learn, and how things that we're familiar with somehow disappear, maybe we regain them. There's all sorts of layers to this that I think directing just completely squashes into this, like, this is my perspective on the world. And I think what makes the immersive field so great is that we can construct the possibilities of these stories that can happen. We can allow for people to enter into these universes and leave with the best stories to tell. Right. And I think as long as the truth of those universes we create is solid, that we distill within them whatever it is that we want to say, no matter what story comes out of it, is going to hold that truth with it. And I think that's when we've done the right job. Like, I think that's when it feels like we've hit something really important.
So do you guys think of yourselves now, instead of storytellers, as story enablers? You're enabling other people to live these stories, to experience these stories.
The makers of storytellers.
Instead of it's that old adage, don't teach a person, don't give a person a fish, teach them how to fish.
Mm-hmm. Or like from Petit Prince, right? Don't teach them to work, but make them long for the immensity of the sea. I forget what the beginning is. It's like, don't give them tasks. If you want to build a ship, don't give them tasks and work.
Right.
Make them long for the immensity of the sea. So make them believe in something much greater than the sum of the parts that you present immediately. Yeah.
I like yours better.
Thanks.
But I think the whole language has changed. But yet it comes down to actually one of the oldest tricks in the book. And for example, my inspiration comes a lot from theater. And I always remember, like at the early stage of VR, the question was, okay, you have a dialogue between a door. Traditional medium, you would film one side of the door and the other side of the door, and you would cut the scene. What do you do with VR? And I remember being at this play in Paris and seeing traditional theater play where the guy would just take the door, shift it, and then you would be on the other side. So, and for me, that was so powerful because you had the same actor on stage, you had the same space, and yet you were at both sides by just this gimmicky motion of the space. So now I think like the biggest tool for us is the space, and I think I'm a bit obsessed by it. But I think moving the space around and having a viewer move inside the space is our new language, actually. And so now I don't think we are crafting frames. I think we are crafting paths. And I think this is a way to see what we're doing, and I think we are learning a lot from video gaming and actually theater.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that resonates really strongly with how we think of it. We actually refer to maybe the best possible experience as the golden path. So a
exactly.
path. And it's okay that not everyone experiences the golden path. We have tons of affordances for choice. But eventually, and people talk about story branching, and we refer it to as story twigging, because we wanted to come back onto this golden path. And we don't want the story to wait for you. You know, I think that is a characteristic of a game as we currently understand that, is they'll often wait for you to do something like flip a switch or open a door, and that's really not that interesting for us. I think we want to tell you a story. The idea of choose your own adventure or infinite choice is at odds with what I've come to experience the audience really wanting, which is curated experience. So the choice, but really to be told a story and to follow a narrative and to experience something. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the same thing for me. Like, I think I'm quite a control freak when it comes to telling stories, and I don't think it's a problem to like have a very curated story. In fact, there's, I think to try and build the emotion of a certain scene when you can allow someone to change that flow too much can affect the final outcome of it. So you won't necessarily get the power. Some people might not come away from that story with what you wanted them to feel from it. So yeah, it's like trying to give over some agency, like allow them to explore in certain ways. And sometimes people can explore in surprising ways. Like people sit down watching stuff, and it's like, how does that look? Like, how are you experiencing this thing? I didn't expect anyone to sit down and watch this thing kind of play out. But they still get the same flow. So there's still moments in there where there's a very curated narrative that is building towards an emotional feeling, and you can still achieve that, even if they're breaking the rules in their own little ways and stuff.
a golden path still. So let me ask you about technology. In the early years of this type of work, the tech was almost all about that. You couldn't get away from it. And my real feeling, looking at the work that you all do, is that the technology has disappeared. I don't think about it. I am in those stories, I'm being moved, and yet you're all working with so many different technologies too. I mean, whether it's drones or sub-packs or branching narratives and gaming engines and VR headsets. How do you think about the tech? In many cases, I know you're helping to kind of create it as you go, because we're still so early in all this. It's not like it's just, oh, here's the 6 tool, here's a toolbox. Everyone just use the same set of tools. You're making tools, you're choosing tools. Anyway, how do you think about that tech when you're trying to tell those stories? Is it an obstacle? Is it an opportunity? You're creating cameras while you're taking pictures. How's that feel?
Well, I've never. I mean, starting a project is a very troubling process, technologically wise, because what I always say is it takes a lot of tech to make you forget that there are any. Actually, it takes very good tech to make you, like a magic trick, to make you forget that there are so many gears and rigs behind the magic tricks. And this is at the core of the design, is to have the viewer forget about it. I mean, I don't think there are that many, so it's such a technological piece, Alice or Jack. And yet, in the end, I want the viewer to not speak about tech at all, which is a very troubled process, because actually, it's like you said, we are building them together with the art. I mean, all the tech inside of Jack, I would be in touch with every single tech provider from every single piece of technology inside the piece to make it happen. So there is no technological way to go right now that I would say, okay, I'm going to build stories this way for dozens of years, like I would say in traditional medium. I can use this camera for 10 years and I'd be happy with it. I mean, I've never shot a 360 film with the same exact rig twice. So this just says it all.
It's changing so fast. Yeah. Well, you worked at Google for a lot of years.
I did. Yeah. Technology was my companion quite in all sorts of ways. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm biased because I didn't go into VR because I thought I wanted to. I did it because it found me. A group of engineers. I was a filmmaker at Google actually before, which if you don't know what that means, I didn't really know either. But I made stuff as best I could, and I was approached by a group of engineers who said, we're working on this camera, immersive camera, and we'd love to work with you on it. And then I ignored the email because I thought maybe they sent it to the wrong person. And then they sent it again a couple of days later being like, we really want you to work with us on this. Can you make it happen? And that ended up, I went to hang out with them and I saw their, the first stitch, which is the jump rig is 16 GoPros in an array, essentially. It's changed now, but it used to be that on like what looked like a really like rickety plastic thing that they had just printed out, and it was just this thing. And I saw the first time I saw something that I thought was amazing was just the engineers hanging out with each other. And they turned on the rig for the first time, and they were just ecstatic, like throwing things, running around it. And it was the most real interpretation of engineering that I've ever seen. Like, you got that they were so excited about this. And I've been at Google for so long trying to make films about engineers and technology, and here they just filmed this one thing with this rig, and it did it. And I was like, ah. And then I had to work with them. I'm like, there was no choice. There was no going back. So I think I have a lot to owe the technology for enabling me to explore this medium and to be a part of it in this way. And it answered all sorts of weird questions I had about my own medium when I was working in film. Like I wanted to do stuff that was more immersive, stuff that like felt more like a game versus like a traditional narrative, film. And I felt like finally I had a chance to do it. That said, it is frustrating as heck. I mean, I had to be, like, it was in Python code. I don't even know Python. I had to, like, go out. I was in the middle of Iceland with Python code, just, like, trying to contact engineers. GoPros were breaking all over the place. I was on Arecibo, which was, like, one of the largest radio telescopes in the world, and I didn't realize that it was, like, this. And so when they moved it, the rig was here, and it just fell. Yeah. I mean, we actually stitched that footage, and it was great. You just run down to the corner and get another
one, right?
What's that?
You just run down to the corner and get another one.
Yeah. Well, exactly, and that was the problem. There was 2 prototypes, and I had already broken one, and it was the second day I was on this trip. So it was and I've been running around with batteries, and it was an insane thing. But to what you said, Matthias, like it's you connect so much more with your work because of the struggle. And I think that we all have come up with workflows and solutions and talked to some amazing creators that are working on these things and making them more accessible for people that I think we're getting better at it. It's not done yet, but we're working on it.
I love that idea that it's the struggle that helps you to appreciate the work or make it better. It's very rare, I think, to have artists and storytellers who have to be so proficient with technology as well. Reminds me of those early days of the 8x10 camera and these photographers out west having to carry glass plates and record and chemicals and this big box and develop the thing right there and then. And I mean, that's basically the version of the story you just told.
Look at Vertov, right? Like they had to modify, Cinema Verite happened because they modified a war camera in order to make something portable that they could follow things around, people around with. Like they hacked. They were hackers, some of the earliest hackers. Editing came as a result of let's just do, we're just going to sit in a room with all this stuff and make something happen. There was no blueprint, there was no book, there was no panel. Right. It was you just went and did it and broke stuff and see what happened.
So I have two other questions, and we're going to run out of time really fast. But one is, I love this thing that we touched on, which is the borrowing and sharing and stealing from each other. Right, because you're all pioneers, and it's so early, and there is no playbook, and literally things like this, like Phi Center and Future of Storytelling and a handful of others, are the places where you can gather, see the coolest thing, and say, oh, I'm going to take that. But everyone's very friendly towards each other. How do you feel about being able to inspire, steal, borrow, collaborate?
Yeah, since I popped the balloon on that one, first I will say it's kind of comes from the last question, which is you have to know the limitations of your craft, and you think they are this, and then someone does this, and you say, oh, that's possible. What can we do on top of that? Right. And I think that's the nature of all innovation. So just seeing that something's possible is inspiring, and that gives you enough inspiration to take some risk to do something on your own. And I would say that this community has been unusually polite to each other, and I think it's the nature of it. It hasn't necessarily monetized yet. Right? So that could change, right? But it's gone on for a while, and we're all still pretty cool with each other. But I will also say that it's not just this community, right? The first thing we do is look at film and then look at game. And for me personally, I looked at immersive theater in a very significant way. And now those 3 points of the triangle are collapsing into a single point, which is this is what we've done over the last 2 years, and what are the next 2 points of the triangle that we go out and explore. And someone said something very profound to me, which we now embody at our studio, which is that diversity, as we know it currently, is about race and sex, but what it's really about is diversity of background and experience. And the more that you can disrupt yourself with someone who has not experienced anything like you experienced growing up, the faster you're going to get to some of these solutions. And so we are actively going out and trying to find people that have never worked in entertainment, that are working in experimental computing, just to see what new things can get us super excited about storytelling.
It's great.
We kind of all embarked on a quest all together, because, that's why it's so excited about VR right now, is I don't see why anybody would want to do traditional cinema right now, because we are building a language all together right now.
Right.
So it feels like each project is opening doors, and each project is enabling new ways to tell story. And that's why I think the community is still friendly, because I think we are in this early stage where we don't even know what VR is going to look like. What is a VR cinema? What is it going to be? It is at the same time very exciting and very troubling, because we should not stop at one point, and that's very important because, for example, 360 video was the main VR project everybody was doing a few years ago, and then everybody shifted to more real-time engine stuff, and then a tech is coming up, and everybody's jump into the tech. And so what I'm trying to avoid also is to just feel like we're doing some kind of a war race or like a tech race, and we need to take some time also and say, okay, we can do very intense, immersive spaces, but 360 linear storytelling is still something very interesting. So we need to be very aware that the tech doesn't overcome all the narrative and all the language stuff that we came up with, because I think it's going to be very diverse, and I think VR is a huge space, and it needs to stay that way. It needs to not stick to video gaming or stick to real time or stick to 360 videos, and it needs to be diverse.
I think that goes along with the diversity of experiences as well, where I feel like, one of the things I'm really excited about doing is combining a lot of these technologies, because we silo ourselves. We're like VR, AR, 6.3. Like it's about creating some place for these things to coexist so that we can get to whatever this immersive future is. This is all, VR won't be what it is now in the next 5-10 years, maybe not even next year, you don't know. These things, in my 3 years of being with the Google team and doing immersive, they were Cardboard, then they were Google VR, then they were Google VR AR, and when I left they were Google AR VR. So if that has any indication that no, they don't even know, I don't know what else to tell you. I mean, it's like we're all going to just have to work and bring all this stuff together and just experiment and explore and see where we get.
So, predictions. Where is it headed?
The holodeck.
The holodeck? That's one good version.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, we had the talk from Douglas. I mean, it's all in the movies.
Yeah.
VR is going to be this. It's going to be a virtual space you can exist in. It's going to be full sensation storytelling and spatial interaction, and maybe it's just going to be in your brain, or maybe it's going to be you moving inside the space. But it's funny because we know what it should be since the beginning, since the 50s. We know what it should be, but now we are a step by step coming this way, and I think we all know where it's heading.
I think that's like deep future thinking. Is like it will be more real than real, but like next steps, like the next exciting steps, I think are going to be stuff like having multi-user stuff. So like many people in the same experience, like maybe something akin to Sleep No More, where you've got lots of people experiencing one of these storylines, and then the dynamic between those and their interactions between them, and how, something like, I guess then it starts to get a little deep future Westworld and stuff like that. But yeah, the kind of in the short term, there's a few exciting things that are kind of going to be happening. I don't know if anyone else has got any interesting ones of those little next baby steps.
What are you looking at me for?
In case you got one.
What do you mean?
Like the next baby steps of cool things that are happening, like interacting with people or haptics or
immersive audio will be huge. I think that that's something that I'm really passionate about and working on in a pretty serious way. Is Bose AR last year at South by Southwest showcased their audio only AR experiences, and everyone who's worked in VR knows about visual fidelity and how much that's a boatload of fun. So the idea of like how audio has always been this persistent, high quality thing is incredibly immersive. And you can take people to all sorts of places, and it's easy to deliver. I think there's a huge not only just like promise from a creative standpoint, but from a market standpoint. I still think that we still haven't gotten to the fundamental reason why this stuff even exists for people. Like, I think from an artistic standpoint, it's very satisfying, and I think it's great in the context of a museum or wherever, where you're able to go in and have these really artfully made emotional experiences, but people still don't know why they should buy a big bulky thing and put it on their face that's expensive, that changes every year, that doesn't work half the time. I mean, it's tough for people to really grok why they should care about this. And I think what's been really cool is seeing how, there's really great applications for immersive stuff from a functional standpoint. Training is a great example. Tourism is another example. People actually doing a functional thing. And they're not always the best experiences. They're not always the most beautiful or artful experiences, but they work. And then you have beautiful, artful experiences that no one can get to and no one understands why they're even there. And they go into them, they're like, what does this even mean? And I think there's this beautiful sweet spot between those two things where you can make really really beautiful, artful experiences that tap into something that's fundamentally important to people. And I think that that's why films really filled a void for a lot of folks. I think that there was something there that just really worked, and I think we need to find that for this stuff. And I think in the short term, you'll start to see that actually happen.
Definitely. And Baby Step, I mean, Oculus is doing things right. Baby Step is untethered mobile headset that just track themselves inside the
No
space.
headset is the next step.
No headset is the deep future, but untethered headset is going to be the norm. Tracking themselves is going to be the norm. But the problem is right now we are all going back to mobile performance, real-time mobile performance, and so it's not going to get to the level of visual expectation that everybody has with VR right now. So we also need streaming to this type of device, so that you're going to have very high-end graphics and volumetric rendering with self-tracked headsets. And I think that's the short-term thing we are all heading to.
But that's going to open up like nomadic storytelling as well, like very large-scale experiences where you can have huge spaces with people in.
Thanking all of you for being here to participate, and thank you to our artists, our storytellers for participating. So how about a round of applause?